Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long, erratic shadows on the linoleum floor of the hospital's deserted wing. Margaret shuffled slowly, her cane tapping against the cold tiles. Her silver hair was tied back in a loose bun, and the wrinkles on her face deepened as she squinted into the dimly lit corridor. She wasn't sure why she had ended up there. The letter she received earlier that day simply read, "Come to St. Mary's Hospital, East Wing, Room 402. Urgent." The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the note bore her name. It nagged at her, tugging at some deep instinct she couldn't ignore. The East Wing had been abandoned for years, ever since a fire had gutted the lower floors. But tonight it didn't feel empty. Faint whispers seemed to echo around her, impossible to pinpoint. Margaret paused, leaning against the wall to steady herself. Her heart raced, but she pressed on. She had to know. As she neared room 402, the whispers grew louder, indistinct murmurs layered with sobs. The air grew colder, biting through her thick cardigan. The door to the room was ajar, swinging slightly as if beckoning her inside. Margaret pushed it open, her breath hitching. The room was lit by a single, flickering bulb. Dust and cobwebs clung to the furniture, but the bed was freshly made, its white sheets pristine. On the bedside table, a photo frame faced away from her. She stepped closer, her cane thumping softly on the floor. Her trembling hand reached for the frame. When she turned it over, her knees nearly buckled. It was a picture of her younger self holding a baby, her late husband standing proudly beside her. She hadn't seen that photo in decades. It had been lost in a flood years ago. "Margaret," a raspy voice whispered behind her. She spun around, her eyes wide. No one was there, but the whispers hadn't stopped. They grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices calling her name. The room began to twist and distort, the walls seeming to close in. Shadows slithered across the ceiling, their shapes vaguely human but wrong in every way. "Who's there?" Margaret shouted, her voice cracking. Her cane wobbled in her grip, but she held it like a weapon. The voices stopped abruptly. A chilling silence fell, broken only by the rhythmic creak of the door swinging behind her. Slowly, a figure emerged from the corner of the room. It was a woman, her face shrouded in darkness, but Margaret recognized the outline immediately. It was her. But this version of herself was frail, skeletal, and her face was twisted in an expression of pure anguish. "Why didn't you come sooner?" the apparition rasped. Margaret stumbled back, her mind racing. "What are you talking about? Who are you?" "You left me here," the ghostly figure hissed, stepping closer. "Forgotten. Alone." Tears streamed down Margaret's face as fragmented memories surfaced. Of a hospital stay decades ago, of a fire, and of the patients who had been trapped. She remembered now. She had been there when it happened. She had escaped. Not everyone had. "I didn't," Margaret began, but the figure lunged toward her, and everything went black. When Margaret woke, she was lying in her bed at home, drenched in sweat. The clock on her nightstand read 3:33 a.m. She clutched the sheets, her heart pounding. Had it all been a nightmare? Her gaze fell on her bedside table, and her breath caught. The photo from room 402 was sitting there, the glass cracked. Beneath it was a piece of paper, the same handwriting as the letter she received earlier. "Don't forget us again." Margaret stared at the note, the whispers echoing faintly in her mind. Margaret's hands trembled as she clutched the note. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and the room seemed unnaturally still. She scanned her surroundings, half expecting the walls to ripple or shadows to emerge from the corners. But nothing stirred, only the faint sound of her clock ticking. The photo, now perched ominously on her nightstand, felt heavier than it should have been. Its cracked glass seemed to glint accusingly in the dim light. Margaret's mind raced. She hadn't been back to that hospital since the fire all those years ago. She had buried those memories deep, convinced they would never resurface. Now, it seemed the past refused to stay buried. The next day, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The shadows in her cozy little house seemed darker, stretching unnaturally across the floor. Small things were out of place. Her favorite teacup suddenly missing. A window she swore she had closed now slightly ajar. Even her beloved cat, Whiskers, avoided her, hissing at the empty air in the hallway. Margaret decided she couldn't stay home. With a trembling resolve, she dressed in her thick coat and scarf, grabbed her cane and called a cab. Her destination was clear: St. Mary's Hospital. She had to face whatever was haunting her. When the cab pulled up to the derelict building, her resolve wavered. The hospital loomed like a skeleton against the gray November sky, its windows shattered and vines creeping up its crumbling facade. She almost told the driver to turn back, but something pulled her forward. A whisper she couldn't quite hear but felt deep in her bones. The main entrance was locked, the doors chained shut with rusted padlocks. Margaret made her way around the side, her cane crunching over the frost-covered weeds. To her surprise, a service door was open, its hinges creaking as it swayed in the wind. She stepped inside. The air was musty and stale, carrying the faint metallic scent of rust, or was it blood? The corridors were darker than she remembered, the peeling paint on the walls giving the impression of claw marks. Margaret moved cautiously, her cane tapping against the uneven floor. She could feel the weight of the building's silence, oppressive and almost alive. As she neared the east wing, faint echoes reached her ears. The sound of laughter, distant and distorted, followed by the unmistakable cries of a baby. Margaret's grip tightened on her cane. She told herself it was just her imagination. But then she heard her name again, soft and pleading. Margaret! Her heart sank as she recognized the voice. It wasn't the spectral rasp from the night before. It was clear and familiar. It was her daughter's voice. But that was impossible. Her daughter, Emily, had died in a car accident when she was just a baby. Emily? Margaret called out, her voice cracking. She hurried forward, ignoring the way the shadows seemed to writhe around her. She followed the sound, her cane tapping faster, her steps quickening despite her age. The sound led her to the same room as before, room 402. The door was wide open this time, and a soft, warm light spilled out into the hallway. Margaret hesitated before stepping inside. The room was transformed. It no longer bore the marks of decay. Instead, it was pristine, almost glowing. The hospital bed was neatly made, and sitting on it was a little girl in a white dress, her hair tied back in pigtails. She held a stuffed bear and looked up at Margaret with wide, tearful eyes. Emily, Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her face. The girl tilted her head, her expression both sad and curious. "Why didn't you come back for me, Mommy?" she asked, her voice soft but accusatory. Margaret dropped her cane, sinking to her knees. I didn't know," she sobbed. "I thought you were gone. I thought I lost you." Emily stood and walked toward her, her small feet making no sound on the floor. She reached out and touched Margaret's face with cold, delicate fingers. "I waited for you, but you never came." Margaret tried to pull her daughter into an embrace, but her arms passed through the child as if she were made of smoke. The warmth of the room evaporated instantly, replaced by a chilling wind that seemed to howl through the walls. Emily's form began to flicker, her eyes darkening. "You left me," the child's voice deepened, overlapping with others, dozens, maybe hundreds of voices. "You left all of us." The room erupted into chaos. The bed dissolved into ash, and the walls cracked and groaned. Shadows poured in like a flood, swirling around Margaret as she screamed. Faces emerged from the darkness, twisted in anguish and rage. They reached for her, their cold hands pulling at her clothes, her hair, her very soul. Margaret's screams echoed through the hospital, but no one heard them. When dawn broke, St. Mary's Hospital stood silent once again, its east wing as lifeless as ever. But in room 402, the photo frame sat on the dusty floor. The picture had changed. It now showed Margaret standing alone in the room, her expression frozen in terror. Beneath it, a new note had been placed. "She belongs to us now.